If you've ever been in a legal conflict or maybe a dispute at work or maybe even one involving your school and was wondering, is there another approach beside either caving in, fighting, or going to court? Stick around because this video is for you. In this video, I'm going to tell you what alternative dispute resolution is and why it can be a really great way to help you resolve a dispute, get what you want, and to do so without spending a huge amount of money. So let's get started. What is alternative dispute resolution? So this is a phrase that really came to light in the 1970s. And when we talk about alternative, what it really meant was a set of processes for resolving disputes and conflicts that did not involve going to court, so that did not involve formal legal proceedings. So when we talk about alternative dispute resolution, we mean a process that's like negotiation, or a process that's like a mediation, or a facilitation, or an arbitration, or a restorative circle. So all of those processes are ways of handling or resolving conflicts that don't involve going to court. In 1976, at the Pound Conference, the late Frank Sander gave a very famous talk called Varieties of Dispute Processing. And he was a Harvard Law School professor, actually one of my mentors, and to be honest, one of the most amazing people I ever met. But he gave this very famous talk where he suggested that courts were really overwhelmed with cases that could be resolved in other ways and that ought to be resolved in other ways. In other words, that the court system wasn't the right dispute resolution process. And he later wrote an article called Fitting the Form to the Fuss. And the idea was, how can we look at a conflict or look at a dispute and then design a process for resolving that in a way that was low cost, created high value, and actually met the interests of the parties. So I want to talk now about what are some advantages of alternative dispute resolution, or for short, what we call ADR. One of the key advantages of ADR is that the parties involved actually retain control of the outcome. So if you are a disputant in a court, ultimately, either the judge or a jury decides the outcome. And usually it's either one party is liable and the other isn't, or one party is negligent, or one party is guilty, or they're not negligent or not guilty. In other words, it's pretty binary. But in an ADR process, like a mediation or a negotiation, the outcome has to be agreed to by the parties who are involved. And that ability to retain control is really valuable to disputants. The second big advantage is because the parties retain control of the outcome, it creates opportunities for lots of creativity. So if you imagine a very common dispute, let's say spouses that are getting divorced, if that goes to litigation, someone's going to get physical custody, someone's going to get legal custody, the judge is going to decide where the kids are, on what days and at what times. But if the parties can mediate that, they can be really creative. So for example, if one partner really wants the kids at Christmas time and the other partner thinks it's really important to get them at Thanksgiving, they can negotiate that. Or if a partner cares a lot about sending their kids to a particular summer camp, they can negotiate that, right? They can agree to that, and you have a lot more creativity in terms of outcome. Third, in almost all instances, an ADR process is lower cost. And it's lower cost in a number of different ways. First, right, in the quote, most obvious way, which is monetarily, litigation is really expensive. You have to have lawyers. There's usually all sorts of things like discovery. Sometimes there's depositions. If we can mediate or negotiate it, we might not even need the lawyers, but we certainly can save some money. But it's also lower cost usually in terms of the emotional toll it takes on the parties. Litigation, is pretty tough on parties. So let me move on to a fourth advantage of ADR processes is that resolution usually comes more quickly. Because in most jurisdictions, both in the United States and frankly around the world, courts are completely overburdened, it can take a very long time to get a result. But a mediation or an arbitration or facilitation or negotiation can usually be worked out much more quickly, allowing the parties to move on. A final real advantage of ADR processes is that there's a possibility of reconciliation or a restored relationship. And when you go to court, typically it's pretty brutal, and in the end, you just have a winner or a loser. But in a ADR process, you could often reach a mutual gains outcome, and part of what you can address is underlying relational interests of the parties. As a mediator, some of my most rewarding moments haven't been just working out the substantive issues, but it's been actually seeing some healing or reconnection between the parties. For example, some years ago, I was working on a family dispute. So the parents had passed away, and the children were in conflict over how to allocate various vacation properties, important valued family mementos, things like furniture and china, etc. And the relationships were seriously fractured. There was a lot of bitterness. And before I began the mediation, I made it clear that one of my styles and a preference for me, if the parties are open, is to address both the substantive issues, but also the relationship issues. And so if there was an interest amongst the siblings to do that, I would be happy to do that. And there was a little skepticism, but I could see also some real interest. And it was a hard mediation. But what became clear to me early on is that the fights over who got the china or who got the lake house were less about who got the china and who got the lake house, and more about a whole set of historic hurts and slights and sometimes feelings that a parent had favored one child and not the other. And so breaking that open and finding a way to talk about that constructively actually was the real value in that mediation. But mediation or ADR, it isn't just for family disputes or commercial disputes, right? It can also be used in communities. Some years ago, working with some of my students at Harvard Law School, I had the opportunity to work with the police department in the city of Everett, Massachusetts. So, to the really great credit of the police chief at the time, they had reached out to us and said, we have this ongoing conflict and tension in our community between our police department, which at that point was still primarily white, and the community, which had really changed demographically and was mostly people of color. And in particular, the conflict was around youth of color and the police. And so rather than waiting for some really explosive and negative thing to happen, the police said, we would like to work with you to develop some processes and approaches to reducing tensions and to creating more connection between the police department and young people. And so over a multi-month process, we worked closely talking to young people in the high school and in community centers and talking to police officers. And that really creative process allowed us to do all sorts of things like find ways for police to do a better job recruiting youth of color into the police force. One of the other things we did is in Everett High School, we set up, working with the school system and the police, a little area in the cafeteria that was called Cops Corner. And every day a different police officer would have lunch in the school, and kids who had questions or wanted to engage with the police officer could eat with them. So one of the real beauties of ADR is that it allows this creativity, right? It allows all the parties to be part of the outcome, and it allows people to have improved relationships with each other. So I want to urge you, if you find yourself in conflict, whether it is at school or at work or with a family member or in your community, before either just caving in or fighting or taking it to court, explore what ADR possibilities might exist. Often there are as a local community mediation, or perhaps an ombuds office, or someone perhaps who's maybe a minister in a church or mosque or synagogue who can play that mediator role. because that can make a real difference to both preventing disputes, but also resolving them amicably and with value creation. So if you're interested in learning more about a particular ADR process, specifically mediation, keep watching this next video, which is what are the steps in the mediation process? And be sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and ring the bell. I'm Bob Bordone, and thanks for negotiating. Okay, you know you want to learn more about mediation. Keep watching.